Welcome to back. Those of you who read the papers know that the UCC is struggling in a few ways, and so we're lucky that we're still here. We won't be meeting every week, and as you know, we don't have food yet, but we might be able to rectify that moving forward. The schedule of events has been set for this quarter. If you Google UCLA back and then look at speaker series, upcoming presentations, you can see what's on the horizon here. And I want to introduce our new Beck assistant, Casey Schlepper, who is a marvelous administrator. I worked with her before. I'm very happy that she's going to be doing this with me. For those of you who are new to Beck, we meet here approximately on alternate Mondays. So see the schedule online for details about that. We're going to try to make this hybrid for students who are writing up remotely and for people from other institutions, because this is a really widely known series and people really do like to sign in from other places too. We're going to try to have as many speakers come in person as possible, but because of all the budgetary uncertainty, we're going to be doing probably more and more Zoom as the year goes on. So we haven't really planned winter and spring yet. We'll see. So 4 out of the 5 speakers this fall are in person. Even when we have one that's just Zoom from Germany, we'll still meet here so we can be a community, and we'll watch that together. Let's see. So Casey will send out announcements regarding the status of lunch or no lunch. So we hope that there will be lunch in the future. Stay tuned. And so before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to give a brief announcement about what's coming up. We do have an exciting lineup for the fall. October 20th, we'll have Stacy Rosenbaum, who got her PhD from here long ago and now is at Michigan. And her talk is called The Long Arm of Childhood, What Other Primates Teach Us About the Early Life Origins of Aging and Resiliency. And so she'll talk about baboons and about gorillas and some about humans. November 3rd, we will have our first talk in the Beck series, to my knowledge, about plants. Yes, plant behavior, communication, and personality. Very exciting. And then November 17th, we will hear from Brett Beheim from MPI, Evolutionary Anthropology Institute. That one will be just Zoom. And he has not given us the title of his talk yet, but probably something about his long-term research with the Chimani. And then December 1st, we'll have a talk from our new neighbor at UCSB, Katie Sayers, who will talk about loneliness and health, insights from the Chimani Health and Life History Project. And today's talk is by Stephan Kaufhold, who's a recent PhD from UCSD, who does all kinds of exciting work in comparative cognition. 3 different ape species and macaques, and a variety of methods, some traditional, some quite novel, and I won't talk much about his work because he will do a better job than I would. I do want to remind you also to sign in if you haven't, because our tenuous ability to get funding depends on showing that we have participants. So please do, and also if you're a student, your grade depends on you showing up. So for both of those reasons, please sign in. And is everybody who signed in who's already in the room, or should I send that around? Okay, I'll send it around to sign it in before you leave. And I want to thank also our funding, which comes mainly from the dean, but also from anthropology and Department of Communication and a few private donors. So thank you, and welcome, Stephan.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. I was very excited when Susan asked me, because I've been watching lectures, the online recordings on YouTube for many years. So very excited to be here in person and see the other side of the room that I didn't get on the video recordings. The talk I'm going to give today is partially from my dissertation defense, where I presented 4 empirical projects, but I'm only going to talk about 2 of them here. I'll briefly hint at the other ones, and you can still chat with me afterwards, so I can send you the papers of those. And the second half of the talk, I'm going to focus a little bit more on discussing why a lot of the topics relating to the context that we should observe primate behavior in is also very relevant for machine learning data sets. And I'll talk a little bit about the work on computer vision that we're doing related to that, and then also some questions about animal communication and machine learning But a little bit of background, before coming to cognitive science at UCSD, studied psychology and have a more traditional comparative psychology background, where I did a lot of experimental work, which I still do, but then throughout my PhD, I was definitely influenced by 4E cognition and distributed cognition, which our department, CogSci at UCSD, is somewhat famous for. Okay, let's see if my clicker works. It does not. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to start with a kind of a definition by Kappeler and van Schaik on social interactions, and they stated social interactions are shaped by the distribution of risks and resources in the environment and their interactions. And I'm also going to argue throughout the talk that both the evolutionary and developmental origins of social cognition and behavior are fundamentally grounded in embodied and enacted social interactions, which themselves take place within broader social and physical environments. So for my dissertation, I focused on looking at how primates resolve resource conflict with each other, and I'm also going to present 2 empirical projects on that. But throughout the talk, I'm going to argue that how primates specifically resolve resource conflict depends on specific social relationships that need to be taken into account, specific environments, also relationships within environments and the way that these interact, and also effects of relationships on environments. And as I mentioned, I'm kind of taking a 4E cognition approach, which means that cognition is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And the 2 talks projects I'm going to focus on specifically, the first one will be on food transfers in orangutans, and the second one on what we call socially situated navigation, where we did social tolerance tests in groups of Japanese macaques and used computer vision tools to get accurate measurements of their trajectories. And we looked at how they navigate to food resources in relation to where other individuals of the group are and their rank. So coming from more experimental work, the reason I'll argue this actually matters is that oftentimes comparative psychologists and cognitive scientists more broadly use model-driven experimental approaches that are very much focused on processes rather than activities and domains of life. And oftentimes, the advantage of gaining rigor with experimental methods will come at the expense of neglecting context. And Paul Rosen also gave a couple of talks here already, I saw, of course, makes that point for social psychology and psychology more broadly. But context really matters for understanding social interactions, so we should not neglect the social situation, in the words of Goffman. So in terms of evolution of behavior and cognition, a little bit of background. Konrad Lorenz stated that the bodies and minds of animals indirectly represent properties of selective environments. So for example, when we look at the fins of fish or flippers of dolphins, all of those have somewhat similar shapes and resemble each other because they indirectly represent properties of water and are basically selected for efficiently moving through water. And of course, in that example, water is a very predictable environmental selective pressure where you can perhaps evolve very specific physiological solutions to deal with that. But less predictable environments led to the evolution of perception and cognition to guide behaviors. So fundamentally, a lot of cognition basically is to deal with less certain, unpredictable features of the environment to guide behavior. It has also been, of course, discussed that specifically the demands of sociality are some of the key drivers of primate intelligence, where many prominent theories focus on social cognition to explain primate cognition and also distinctly human abilities. And of course, human cognition is a specific form of primate cognition. So if someone is interested in human cognition, I argue you should definitely also understand primate cognition more broadly. And Tomasello in recent years also has focused a lot on discussing individual agency. Basically something, I'll basically read his quote. He states that in the face of unpredictability, nature needs someone on the ground to assess local conditions in the moment and decide on the best course of action. What thus evolves is an underlying psychology of agency that empowers the individual to decide for itself what to do according to its own best judgment. So agency is not about what animals are doing, but how they are doing things. So my projects try to address how primates are resolving resource conflict. And to also zoom back, talking about sociality, of course, sociality is a trade-off. There are a lot of benefits like better protection against predators, better resource holding potential, better access to mates, coalition, and cooperative partners, and a lot of social learning opportunities. But it also comes with some risks, for example, increased risks of parasites and infectious diseases, which Dan is also working on, of course, but also indirect and direct competition over the same resources. And that's what the projects I'm going to talk about will focus on. But let's start to kind of frame it as the different contextual variables that matter. For example, if a primate encounters some piece of food on the ground, it might first assess the properties of the food, some affordances. Is this edible? Can I access the food? But then to complicate things, oftentimes there will be conspecifics around that might also want to go for the same food and have the same processes going on. And of course, within primate groups, they have social relationships, basically where past interactions influence future ones. And for example, in macaques, there are dominance hierarchies where dominance will give priority of access. You might, for example, have the subordinate macaque and the dominant one. But to complicate things, and then there's, of course, a social dimension to this food resource, besides like the dimension of just assessing if you can eat it and access it. And to complicate things, like in the wild, all of this will take place in specific physical environments. For example, it might be possible for the subordinate monkey to maybe grab the food and run off to a location where the dominant might not be able to follow. But there are also specific social environments where you might, for example, have coalitions that perhaps the subordinate has a coalition with rank 2 and 6 that would outrank rank 3 and 8. So in the social environment, of course, dominance hierarchies, kin relations, coalitions, and perhaps also culture plays a big role. So taking all of these into account, primates have a lot of different options if they want to resolve resource conflict. For example, these strategies mentioned by de Waal say that in order to resolve resource conflict, you could use aggression, just fight over it. You could use tolerance, for example, sharing the food, or you could also avoid either the conflict or avoid the food altogether. So this specific decision-making, what strategies they will choose in any given moment, is what I'm interested in, and also where I think we really need to take this context into account, which sometimes is very difficult to recreate in controlled experimental environments. But with that, basically, in order to understand social interactions and cognition, we need to take into account the specific bodies, affordances, possibilities of specific individuals, which is embedded within specific social environments and physical environments, and enacted in the moment based on what others are doing as well, and also extended that specific environmental features might change what, for example, the affordances of individuals might be behaviorally and cognitively. So if this is somewhat of a sketch of what is relevant to observing primate resource conflict in the wild, something that Susan might be doing when she observes capuchins in the wild, when we try to recreate that in experimental settings, there are a lot of things that, in order to gain rigor, we might inadvertently disregard here. So Usually, it can happen that primates are not even in social cognition tasks directly interacting with conspecifics, but with a human stooge experimenter, where there would be a lack of natural relationships. There might not be a clear history of how me and one primate that might not know me has interacted. So we are already kind of controlling for relationship by disregarding it, more or less. We also usually test animals in not very complex environments, in a fairly constrained context, where we might also affect their affordances. They maybe now have very limited choices that we impose on them in the specific experimental situation. And there might also be issues with systematic sampling biases of the kinds of primates and populations that we're able to test in captivity in experiments. And of course, that's a broad issue that has been discussed in psychology, anthropology, and many other disciplines. For example, the problem of weird subjects that Henrik and colleagues mentioned, meaning that in psychology and cognitive science, most subjects come from Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic populations that are not representative of humanity as a whole, indeed quite the outliers. And Levins and colleagues in the same paper wrote a comment that we have a similar problem when we look at apes, where he coined the term bizarre, where a lot of the apes and primates we're testing are from barren institutional, zoo, and other rare rearing environments. And Webster and colleagues also added to the fact that for any kind of biological study, we should be looking at how strange our animals are, which stands for social background, trapability and self-selection, rearing history, acclimation and habituation, natural changes in responsiveness, genetic makeup, and experience. So all of these things should be considered when we test specific populations. And with all of those problems, I'm kind of leading up to the question is, why wouldn't we just go out and test primates in the wild in their natural ecologies? And of course, primatologists like Susan are doing that, and it's fantastic work that we know what they're actually doing. However, there are also some arguments why it can be still very valuable to test animals in more unnatural environments. And Josep Kahl specifically wrote a paper on that and argues that it's important to assess cognition under various conditions to obtain an idea of its diversity. It informs us about flexibility, which is considered a crucial ingredient of sophisticated cognition. So studying behavioral and cognitive flexibility is key if we want to understand primate and human evolution, and also specifically how primates will solve conflicts. We still want to be able to perhaps introduce some novelty and test their behavioral flexibility, which of course is much easier with experiments and not possible through pure observations. But with that, my kind of motivation is that I want to increase socio-ecological validity in controlled settings to ideally bring both things together and still look at specific conditions that I can affect. So I try to avoid testing environmentally and socially deprived primates because cognitive and behavioral flexibility crucially depend on environmental complexity. And I'm also minimizing the use of human stooges and trained conspecifics when testing social behavior and cognition, and rather try to utilize real-world relationships, which increases also the subject's skin in the game, that it actually matters for them what choices they make. And I also try to minimize separating individuals from their group and not test them in barren confined spaces, but whenever possible, rather in their everyday enclosures with their usual social group. So a lot of the studies I'll show are kind of in the everyday environments of primates, which makes it at least somewhat ecologically valid for them, even though it might not be exactly the same as in the wild. Because agency depends on social and environmental affordances. And maybe to define the term, affordances just means possible interactions between a specific individual and aspects of the environment. So affordances depend on both. For example, like this speaker desk, I might afford that I can lift it up, but someone that is 2 years old might not be able to lift it up. So affordances, again, depend on the specific possible interactions between agents and aspects of the environment. And the first empirical study I'm going to talk about is about food transfers in orangutans, and specifically whether their transfer strategies and success and resistance depends on the specific short-term relational history within dyads. And a little bit of background: food sharing is common in primates and documented, but a lot of the research on food transfers has largely focused on ultimate evolutionary explanations like kin selection and also looking at reciprocity, and tends to analyze transfers as independent events. You might get a breakdown of how often specific primates use different strategies, but not necessarily how they are embedded within specific social relationships and interactions. And some of the findings are that tolerated theft is the most dominant strategy. That's basically that one individual will just take food from another, but will not face any resistance from the food possessor. And there are basically the limitations that if you just end up with counting all instances and you assign them to specific categories, you can maybe get like a sense of what they do, but not really how they do it and how they make specific choices. But as I also argued before, within social relationships, all of these interactions are not one-shot interactions, but they have a history and context, which might be related to also all of these questions of like kinship and other previous interactions, but also the directly preceding and current environmental context. So for this study that I did with my PhD advisor, Professor Rosano, we wanted to investigate how contextual variables and the directly preceding interactions within specific dyads of orangutans would influence food transfers. And for that, we tested a group of socially housed orangutans in their semi-natural enclosures across 40 different sessions. We did 10 sessions every 2 years. That data collection preceded a little bit some of my work, but then I started to collect data for that in 2014 and 2016. And what we basically did was we went to the everyday enclosure of the orangutans that are socially housed in Leipzig Zoo, and we would just get a bunch of bamboo branches, drizzle a little bit of honey over them, and then we would make this big kind of food ball that we just threw into the enclosure, and then we would just film and observe what they do, because usually one individual gets this whole bag of food and is happy about it, but then all of the other ones try to get something, so they kind of have to negotiate if they want to have food, how they can get some to them, by stealing it, by requesting it. And we just looked specifically at that. And we then coded all transfer attempts, so successful and unsuccessful ones, based on the videos, and categorized them into transfer strategies, whether they were successful or not, whether there was resistance by the food possessor, and also the context. For example, in what location was the food bag, and was the one that was trying to get food, for example, in view of the one possessing the food. And just to show you a couple of examples of these kinds of strategies, we coded more detailed ones, but the overarching categories were unresisted taking. You can see this orangutan just walking up to his mom and taking some food branches, and there's no resistance. So that's what also is oftentimes called tolerated theft. He takes it, but faces no resistance. In contrast to that, when we look at resisted taking or untolerated theft, you can see that this one clearly does not want to share the food, and then the adult still ends up getting it. We also observed co-feeding, which we defined that they're feeding from the food resource that still maintains in control of the possessor. So oftentimes mothers might hold these bundles, and their offspring and other infants might just co-feed from it. And we also looked at requests, where basically the initiator would produce a request. Here we see an open hand request, and the mother will hand over a little bit of chewed food to his son. Something that hasn't been documented much, but that we also sometimes observed were active offers. So in this, that's the only one where the initiator is not the one getting food, but the food possessor that actively offers food, like this adult male here. And in terms of what we found, we coded over 3,000 food transfer attempts where 77% were successful. And one of the observations was that actually all of the orangutans used both competitive and cooperative strategies. That is a mixture of untolerated theft that faced resistance, but also requesting, co-feeding, and offering. I'm not going to go into too much detail. That's the main point is here that we see all of them seem to be using quite a variety of strategies. And based on that, we also observed that it was interesting to see that requesting food and offering food, which are oftentimes called active strategies rather than just taking it from someone where not both individuals need to play an active role, were by far the rarest and also least successful ones compared to taking, which can be tolerated or untolerated theft, and co-feeding. So this kind of also begs the question, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, why would they ever do these kinds of requests, for example, if they're less successful? I'm also not going to jump into too much detail of all of the generalized linear mixed models that we ran on this, but we basically looked at predictors of resistance, predictors of success, and predictors of strategy changes, where we took into account the previous interaction of the specific diet, like resistance, success, the previous strategy they used, the current one, the location of the food bag, whether they were in view. We also looked at kinship and how many individuals were in the direct vicinity. And what we found was that basically the preceding transfer attempts within the specific diet and contextual variables were the strongest predictors for success, resistance, and strategy changes compared to kinship and other ones. So that basically means we need to look at the specific history of dyads, even in the very short term, that if they previously, for example, were met with resistance, they might change their strategy and might now use tolerated theft instead of another strategy. And basically, the preceding interactions and contextual variables were more important than kinship, and still the mystery maybe is why there were active food sharing strategies which were present, and we think that they are embedded and enacted strategies with social meaning. So social context and relationships matter, and it might be somewhat similar that if you look at the specific sequence, in humans, if there is some food here to share, maybe someone of you has like a bag of chips, I might perhaps for the first time request it, and once you granted that request, I wouldn't just continue to request it with like a begging gesture or asking you. I might just take that as, oh, apparently it's fine now for me to take the food. And we think that perhaps requests and offers somewhat fulfill a similar role, that it's more about the testing in that moment whether it would be okay to take something, and subsequently it might look, and you might code it like tolerated theft, but within that specific diet, it actually is not tolerated theft necessarily if you granted a request first. Another example, and I'm not going to talk about the study too much that was inspired by this, but just to also make the point that specific environmental affordances matter to basically resolve resource conflict. One time it happened that the youngest orangutan, Suak here, was able to catch the food bag, and all of the others quickly ran after him to take away because his resource holding potential is not exactly great. But he did something really clever. He found a part of the enclosure where there's an electric fence, and he first threw the bag over and then climbed underneath the electric fence. And he was the only one, because he's so small, that was able to climb under it. So I thought that was also quite a good, clever strategy, that if you just go somewhere where no one else can go, you can still end up with the food and basically avoid conflict while still getting the resource. One of the studies that I did, inspired based on that, was with chimpanzees and a more traditional experiment where we basically gave chimpanzees the option to change the pathway of a food using a seesaw construction, where we basically varied the initial orientation, and they could direct the food away from a shared location where both could access it, and towards a location where only they were able to go. And we did basically a 2x2 design on that, and they strategically manipulated their environment and where the food would end up before releasing it to monopolize it. But now to the next project that basically brings together how also specific relationships interact with specific environments, is from the main field site where I collected data at the Born Free USA Primate Sanctuary in southern Texas, where we did some social tolerance tests, and I'm gonna show that in a second, but I wanted to also acknowledge that a lot of this work has been done together with Jack Terwilliger, who is really a more computational person than I am, and we're working still a lot together on using more machine learning methods to generate new kinds of data sets that would be difficult with traditional manual coding. And a little bit of background, one of the things that we try to achieve is to get good tools to measure distances between primates. And of course, social proximity in primates is a very relevant variable that is measured quite a bit because, as I also argued, primate social lives are fundamentally grounded in temporal and spatial relationships. Of course, it's also largely true for humans, but we can also maintain and create relationships beyond temporal and spatial boundaries. And for that reason, of course, a lot of primatologists and researchers in general will use physical proximity as an indicator of social dynamics, for example, to understand affiliation, dominance, and tolerance, and social networks more broadly. And it's also something that is very readily available for primatologists to just code and observe in the moment. And of course, it's also a prerequisite for many other social behaviors, including social grooming, cooperation, and, for example, social learning. But currently, we're lacking tools to accurately measure social proximity in naturalistic settings. Usually, we will use perhaps some categories like within arm's reach and then different kinds of distances, but it is rarely measured in a continuous way. And even tools like GPS, their error margin is too large to be meaningful for these proxemic, socially relevant distances, I would argue. So our goal for this project was to use computer vision to dynamically track social proximity and interactions in real time and in real space. So the sanctuary where I collected a lot of my dissertation data is in southern Texas, as I mentioned, and they have a large population of Japanese macaques, where the original population was moved from the wild in 1972 to southern Texas. And by now they have a lot of different primate species, but still like currently 5 different large Japanese macaque groups that are the descendants of the transplanted population. And part of the work we did was social tolerance tests, where social tolerance is basically defined as the likelihood that you are in close proximity of conspecifics around valuable resources while showing little to no aggression. And for this study, we looked at 2 different groups of Japanese macaques. One consisted of 24 and one of 46 individuals at the time. And the social tolerance tests were inspired by some work by Japanese primatologists and also by Edwin van Leeuwen and Daniel Haun, who did quite a lot of work on social tolerance in apes. And basically, we created a situation where in their everyday enclosures, we would get valuable food, grapes or peanuts, which we varied, and we would spray paint a circle on the ground, and the size of the circle was directly proportionate to the number of individuals in the group and the amount of food as well. So we wanted to create a situation where in a specific area there's somewhat of an equal distribution of valuable food to create, again, an situation where we can observe how they will try to get some of the food in the context of other individuals that are trying the same. And we filmed that with multiple cameras. Mainly the view that you will see is a top-down view captured from the fence on a GoPro. And here, again, we also did some behavioral coding, where specifically the identity, sex, rank, and also the time each individual spent inside of that circle was first manually coded. And here's a sped up version of what one social tolerance test might look like. So you can see there's a lot of coming and going, and usually there are maybe 2 or 3 individuals inside of the circle at the same time at most. This was quite different when I also initially helped out on social tolerance tests in chimpanzees, where you just see like a big pile of chimpanzees and Japanese macaques that are famously described as a kind of very non-egalitarian, despotic social organization. We kind of saw that it seemed to be much more important to keep your distance, and also you see a lot of this coming and going, that some will wait until maybe someone else leaves, and then they will navigate into that circle. So in terms of the descriptive results, I'm just showing it from one field season. We're currently in the process of looking across 3 other field seasons where we did these tests as well. But the main takeaway from this plot is that it indeed was a valuable resource, and you can see that there was an association that higher ranking individuals, especially the alphas in both groups, spent the most time in the circle, and the circle for the 15 minutes that we coded was also occupied over 90% of the time. And on average, across all of the sessions, only 1.5 macaques were inside of that circle. And as I mentioned, it was mainly occupied by the alpha and high-ranking individuals. So the questions we wanted to ask and what we used computer vision for was basically how macaques will specifically navigate into that circle and thereby navigate kind of this opportunity to get food, but also the risk of direct social conflict with others. The algorithm that we trained for that was based on YOLO V8, which is like a very fast off-the-shelf detection algorithm where you can detect in real time, but it does not contain the data set we used for that. Common objects in context does not contain primates as an object to detect. So for that, we used, on the one hand, a macaque pose data set that is openly available, and also one of our chimpanzee data sets that I will talk about later in a little bit. But that was basically to just add an additional category that we now can detect on specific frames of the videos where the macaques are. And for that, we then also used a tracking algorithm that would just try to track. So the little boxes you see are bounding boxes, and when they move from frame to frame, the sorting algorithm would try to track if it's still the same individual, and that way we get a little bit of these little lines that you can see that are the pathways. But one of the big things for this project was that we didn't rely on automating everything with computer vision. We still spent quite a lot of time on manual corrections where the algorithm wasn't able to identify specific individuals. So we did all of that manually. And also whenever the tracker, you can see it's somewhat spotty, would lose any of the monkeys, we also had to relabel it, and we have some missing parts. So we needed to kind of annotate the IDs and also correct to tell that algorithm that that's still the same individual. So it was still quite a bit of manual work. And on top of that, we also did some calibrations where, on the one hand, using a GoPro that has this kind of fisheye look, we needed to correct for the lens distortion to get real-world distances, where we used a checkerboard and exactly look at the properties. But then also importantly, we measured a lot of the points inside of the environment where we went off some like enrichment structures and trees and all of that to basically know some distances, and then we were able to triangulate. And we also had the assumption that it was a flat plane, and this basically turned it into a geometry problem, where we then were able to use homography and project a top-down view of these pathways. And then we also used a Kalman filter for path inference when the tracker lost an individual, to fill in the gaps and look at the most realistic pathway that they might have taken. And we're currently also still improving on that algorithm. By now, the tracker works better, and the path inference also works a little bit better. But nonetheless, for this method already, we wanted to first validate if these real-world distances actually make sense and if the tracker works well. And for that, we had manual annotations using Elan to exactly measure all of the frames that individuals were inside of the circle. So we had somewhat of a constrained space. And then we looked at the results from our tracker to see if that actually matches up. And we found quite a good correlation. So it was Pearson's R 0.995, so quite accurate, and we were happy with that. And just to show you an example of what it looks like, here is another scene where you can see the tracker in action. We see the bounding boxes and the past pathways that individuals took. You also see a tracker of the seconds that they spent inside of the circle right here. And here's also a top-down projection that we get that way. And with that, we basically were thinking, oh, what are the new sort of questions we can ask when we actually have this very highly detailed data of the exact trajectories and pathways that they took into the circle. And with that, we wanted to answer some initial research questions, and we also can talk about that later, working on some additional ways of improving that and measure additional things. But we basically wanted to know how social, rank, sex, and the presence of dominant individuals inside of the circle influence how macaques will navigate inside of it. There's on the one hand how they approach the circle, and then where exactly in that circle they might enter. We tested several hypotheses. The first one was that macaques position themselves farther away from conspecifics than chance when entering the circle. Basically, the sweet spot between I get to the resource, but I'm also trying to stay as far away as possible from you. We also predicted that rank should influence the entry distance from conspecifics. The higher ranking the individual already inside of the circle is, the more likely it should be that the subordinate tries to stay as far away as possible. And then we also predicted that low-ranking macaques would take more circuitous routes before entering the circle, especially, again, in the presence of high-ranking individuals. And in the sped-up video, you saw that a lot of the macaques would kind of wait outside of the circle and sometimes would take circles around it, and that's what we try to quantify with that specifically. And I'll quickly walk through the relevant features here, but basically the white circle in the middle was the resource circle. Then we defined a liminal space, which was a couple of meters outside of that circle to look at that radius that our tracker was able to also correctly quantify. We used an exclusion zone for specifically the question of how they enter in relation to others inside of the circle, because if you're sitting exactly in the middle of the circle, any point you enter from would be equidistant from the center, so we excluded that for this analysis. And if you, for example, have a macaque that's already inside of the circle and one that is entering, we, on the one hand, looked at the pathway they take into the circle, where you have the most efficient path and then perhaps a more circuitous path. But then we also looked at the specific point on the perimeter of the circle to see where do they enter in relation to individuals that are already inside of the circle. So we defined the normalized entry distance, where you can look at the minimum entry distance, which basically would be the point where when you enter, you're as close as possible to the one that is already inside, and the maximum, where you would be as far away as possible from the one that is already inside of the circle. And that was basically our index quantifying the specific point where they enter in relation to where others were. And first from one GLM that we ran. We looked at the entry strategies, where we found that, in general, macaques positioned themselves farther than chance from others when entering the circle, so they tried to maximize distance. And this was especially true for lower-ranking macaques, which avoided entering near the alpha male. And we had sort of like specifically this finding for male macaques, and this did not apply to females. There was a significant difference that females were basically, do I have the females on the, oh yeah, occupier, sex, the interaction. So for the males on, you see quite a strong difference here, same sex versus different sex. Females were much more likely to still enter close to the male, and it didn't play as much of a role. The other thing that I mentioned was looking at how they approach the resources and that circle. And for that, we looked at the path strategies, where we also found that high-ranking macaques took more direct paths into the circle, and you would see that they would just walk straight in. If they're the highest-ranking ones, they wouldn't care about others there and just walk right inside of the circle. And lower-ranking ones still needed to be high-ranking enough that they would dare to enter, but you can see them taking very indirect paths, just circling and inching closer, and also seeming to pay attention what the others are doing that are inside of the circle. So for that, also our takeaway was that social navigation results from weighing food access against conflict avoidance, and we saw these interactions of rank and sex, and specifically the decisions they would make in the moment to go to the food resource to avoid direct conflict, but still navigate to the resource. So our takeaway is what we call situated seeing, that proximity is not just about spatial reasoning, it's shaped by social knowledge and expectations, and macaques will weigh the risks socially with the access to resources. And in a sense, we kind of visualize it as that navigation is the result of superimposing internal structure onto the external experience. So if you imagine that you're the macaque over here and there's the food resource, visually you might just see this landscape of where other individuals are in space, but they are imposing the specific sex and rank relationships that they know based on their social relationships in order to make decisions how and if to navigate towards that resource, again, balancing social risks with food resource rewards here. So the internal structure and external structure are relevant if you want to understand how they navigate. And in our kind of simplified thing, I would also argue actually the social relations were much more predictive of how they would navigate through space than the external structure. But it was also just a fairly plain ground. So basically with that, we conclude that social and physical environments interact, and it's relevant if you want to understand the kind of agentic decision-making in the moment. You need to take all of that into account. So basically that is the one project showing that relationships matter, and that relationships within environments will also specifically predict how they will resolve resource conflicts. And the takeaway is that we really, in order to understand behavior and cognition, look at the context, where again, comparative psychologists might tend to study and classify cognition as mental processes, use model-driven experimental approaches, which can lead to a neglect of the role of specific activities, relationships, and contexts. So increasing socio-ecological validity in comparative cognition can help contextualize behavior and cognition, map diversity, and bridge the gap to also field primatology. And for the last part, I'm also going to argue that this kind of approach of working on more ecologically valid experiments and studies with context-rich data sets is also crucial if we want to improve our machine learning or AI models to understand primate behavior. And I think with the kind of example where we only started working with these new kinds of data, where it would be very tedious and not really feasible to measure exact distances continuously, AI definitely brings a lot of opportunities that we can get some data that we were not able to get before. And that's what we're especially interested in, rather than training algorithms to just match the coding that humans would already be doing. And I think it's exciting, especially for proxemics, where we want to do more work and also look at, for example, head direction as a proxy for where I'm paying attention to. And I'm also really interested to look more into social learning and how exact distances and time spent looking at others might affect outcomes there. So we hope to do a lot of more studies with this kind of tool and continue to improve it. And it's already working much better than in the presentation examples here. But there are also some challenges because there is still quite a gap between computer scientists' assumptions and kind of the ways that a lot of people in the machine learning space think about problems and what people on the ground, for example, primatologists, behavioral scientists, people in animal cognition actually would perhaps need. So we definitely need a lot of expertise because data sets are oftentimes nowadays the bottleneck and arguably one of the most important things for machine learning besides computation and algorithm. So I want to argue that domain experts are needed to provide conceptually grounded and ecologically valid data sets. I already hinted at one of those data sets that our lab, together with collaborators from Beijing University, published, where we created a large data set called ChimpAct, which is a longitudinal data set for understanding chimpanzee behaviors in context. And there already had been quite a bit of great work on computer vision for primates, where we also used other data sets. But we thought one of the shortcomings was that if you want to understand social behavior, you need to know something about the environmental context and specific relationships between individuals. So a lot of data sets would just pull tons of different images of primates off the internet in a lot of different contexts, but you didn't have the specific longitudinal data set that could tell you something about specific social relationships. So for this data set, we used longitudinal data collected from one group of chimpanzees at Leipzig Zoo between 2015 and 18. It was focusing on one specific primate, a zebo, that was growing up and as part of Federico's data set to understand the development of gestures in young apes. But basically, in that group, we had 23 different chimpanzees, and we annotated over 160,000 frames and have also over 64,000 action labels. And we specifically annotated it that we have some pose key point tracking, where you can see for every chimpanzee, we would annotate specific key points that are mainly at joints to get like an understanding of what their specific pose is. We would also annotate their specific identity, sex and age, but then we also provided some behavioral labels where the idea would be with that data set, we hopefully can also contribute that we can get better action recognition based on pose. And for this data set, like one of the big contributions is that it's longitudinal, and we have these very detailed labels that can be used for benchmarking and as the basis for future work to study social dynamics. But we also provided some models and are also publishing a revised version that is much better at recognizing behavior without looking at pose. Very briefly, the ethogram consisted of 23 different behaviors, where about half of them were social behaviors that would be relevant. And for that, basically, the pipeline of the algorithms that we also worked on was that you have the video clip input, and then we have the body tracking and individual identification, which still proves to be quite challenging, the IDing surprisingly. But then there would also be key point detection based on that behavior recognition, and we're able to compose, for example, also social networks based on the ways that they interact. And just to show you a couple of clips of what this looks like in action, on the left you see a regular clip, and on the right you see our ground truth, where we annotated all of these key points, the bounding box, and then again the name and action the individual is performing. So there's definitely room for improvement for some of those, but we're continuing to work, as I mentioned, on using this good ground truth to actually have algorithms that need to have less information. And for example, another thing that we're also working on with the tracking of pathways that I mentioned with the macaques, we actually went out in the environment and measured exact distances to have these points. We're also trying to currently work on ways to basically not that we don't need the actual distances measured and train the model on our old data set, that hopefully it also somewhat is backwards compatible, that we can get a sense of distances without having to physically measure points in the environment. That way it would also be somewhat backwards compatible with a lot of data that is already collected with usually just one camera. So we're kind of trying to work on algorithms that also represent the kind of data that primatologists actually already have collected, instead of creating artificial environments with dozens of cameras for like the sole purpose of that. So we also already have a preprint for the improved model out. If you're interested, I can share that with you. But I want to briefly conclude. I still have a little bit of time, right? Good. Where we specifically also wrote a kind of opinion piece for a large machine learning conference for the kind of data sets and considerations we should have if we want to understand animal communication. So the basic motivation of that was that we want to sort of urge people to avoid some pitfalls based on human-centric data sets that had great success and worked really well. And we kind of argue that animal signals should be understood as tools for influencing others, where meaning comes from function and context and not just sequences and symbolic meaning like we have in human language. So we want to contribute to hopefully get better data sets, to get better models where we can ask questions about meaning and not just the structure of animal signals. And of course, all of you are familiar with the great success of large language models over the past years, which also raised some hopes that we can use similar approaches that work so well for human language to decode animal communication systems. But of course, human language has a lot of design features and also huge data archives. A lot of the kind of training data that is used for large language model is not naturalistic interactions of people talking. It is all the text on the internet and a lot of books and all sorts of other pieces of text that maybe make a lot of sense by themselves, and you don't need to have all of the context, so it's not based on naturalistic social interactions. But it works really well because there's so much structure in that data. So we wanted to address a little bit how AI for animal communication can go beyond structure and towards meaning. And that is also something that I co-authored with Jack Terwilliger and also Federico Rossano. There are a lot of, luckily there's a lot of exciting also initiatives to understand animal communication system, like large research grants, where, for example, for the Color Doolittle Prize, the goal is to have some two-way interspecies interaction where humans will try to understand the communication systems of animals, and you have to basically show that you can have a back and forth conversation with some kind of animal, and it's still like very highly funded, which I think is great news. And you might have also seen that for dolphin communication, Google DeepMind has a large data set with Denise Herzing and colleagues to work on training LLMs on basically dolphin whistles, but they also will have behavioral context, and then they try to work on like a system that not only catches the sound, but can also produce whistles back to dolphins. And it's sort of in the beginnings, but definitely interesting work and exciting times for that. But the contribution that we hope to make is that especially computer vision scientists might just import some assumptions that might hold true for human language that we argue is not warranted for understanding most animal communication systems. So one of those is that meaning can be learned from signal sequences alone that are self-contained distributional semantics, and you don't need much grounding in context or external reference. And human language, for the most part, is referential, where you have signals that function as word-like labels for things, and also the assumption that the primary function of communication is to transfer information, the Shannon-Weaver type model for communication. And just to the first point, for example, when we look at signal sequences that might be very structured, and we have grammar and a lot of combinatorial rule sets in human language, it might be easy to look at some animal communication systems and have data sets where you might think that you're observing the same thing. And in this example, the main point is basically that imagine an individual is producing a request, perhaps even like for food, like a begging gesture. You might have something that basically might look like grammar to you, but what you might actually be observing is that a signaler produces some signal and the recipient is not responding. So you might repeat the same signal again. The other one is still not responding, and then you might switch to another signal. Maybe instead of a begging gesture like that, they produce another one much closer to them, and then you might end up getting a response. And this might somewhat look like an order that is on the surface equivalent to interactions and grammar in humans, but we need to be able to actually tell apart these instances where you have something that has a certain order to it from these instances where you have actual combinatorial rule sets for signal structures rather than kind of inadvertent products from just repeated intentional communication attempts. The other thing that I will kind of combine is the idea that communication is referential, which is probably largely true for human language, and that it's also intended for information transfer, like when you pick up a book and you get all of the information there. But we suggest that we should rather be taking a communication as manipulation approach, which Dawkins and Krebs pioneered, where we would argue that in many instances, what animals are trying to do with signals in the moment is to produce a certain outcome and basically manipulate the conspecific that are best, in general, not physically manipulated, but through signals. So in kind of that metaphor, the signaler is using the signal as a sort of tool to influence the recipient to bring about the change in the world that they want. And that is, of course, and putting a lot of emphasis that we would need to understand what perhaps their specific goal in the world is to understand this exchange. So especially for intentional communication, we believe it is possible to quantify these things in data sets, but they actually need to be included, and only having these signals would not be sufficient. And one example that you might have heard Federico talk about is ontogenetic ritualization. So there's sort of an ongoing debate in primate communication to what extent primate gestures are perhaps innate or socially learned and sort of cultural, which would be maybe a little bit closer to human language. But the third possibility that Tomasello also discussed a lot is ontogenetic ritualization. And this basically occurs when an initially instrumental action gets progressively ritualized into communicative signals based on repeated dyadic interactions. So if, for example, I would like a request to hold your dog's leash, I might initially functionally go there and just take the leash. But if I repeat that a lot, you would anticipate what I'm trying to do. And at some point, if I look at you like this, you would know that I want to hold your dog's leash. And that would be sort of an ontogenetically ritualized signal that would only hold true for the two of us and only exists as the signal within specific dyads. So that would be a large problem if we look at animal communication systems where ontogenetic ritualization might play a big role. We would need to have that specific context of the relationship of a specific dyad, and these signals would not generalize to the species level or even the group level. It's just happening on the dyadic level. And my advisor documented that with colleagues in, for example, bonobos, where you can see that oftentimes infants, to get picked up, might raise their hands, which initially was functional to hang on to the mom and then develops into a signal. And this might on the surface also, because of the affordances, lead to a lot of young bonobos having this similar gesture of just doing this to get picked up. But you also can end up with quite idiosyncratic looking examples. For example, in the data set, one bonobo would do a little spin and do like a 360 in order to request to be picked up. And in their specific history, oftentimes the infant would already start walking away and then turn around to go back to the mom if he saw that she wouldn't follow. And then this specific dyad ended up with this kind of signal, but that was not observed in any of the other dyads. So with this, you wouldn't have generalization across groups or species. And as I already mentioned, we think that's why context is so crucial, especially if we don't know what assumptions hold true and if we don't know what the origins of signals are. So signal origins have definitely strong implications for data sets. So we propose that machine learning researchers that want to understand animal communication should rather take a functionalist framework, emphasizing that animal communication is relational and context dependent. Therefore, adequate models need data sets that actually reflect this, and that by grounding models in function and context, we can avoid these problematic assumptions based on the successes of large language models for human language. This also emphasizes that it is really needed to have collaborations between machine learning researchers that know all about the computational and algorithmic end, but then actual domain experts that will help provide data sets that would contain all of the necessary information. So, of course, that's the case for supervised learning when you provide the ground truth as labels, like what we did with the Chimbak data set. But even for data sets where you want to use unsupervised learning algorithms, it's even more important that you're at least sure that your data set contains all the necessary things that you want to predict. So that's why we argue that to move forward, we actually need longitudinal multimodal data sets, rich contextual annotations, and rather than just measuring whether your algorithm can predict the next signal in a sequence, we should also tie it to functional evaluation metrics. For example, asking whether the model can predict the recipient behavior, the recipient of a signal, or the specific outcome of an interaction. And we think it's also important to actually clarify what questions your data sets or models can possibly address. And we think that Tinbergen's framework to look at mechanism, ontogeny, phylogeny, and adaptation as sort of related but separate questions is important on that. That some data sets might not be at all good to look at the ontogeny of specific signals if they don't contain that specific history, for example. All right, and with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and you can contact me. I can also share the papers that I think can be posted on the website. I also want to thank all of my collaborators and Susan, of course, for inviting me. Thank you.
So we're going to have questions for the next 20 minutes, and then people can go and have coffee. So people who aren't going to coffee maybe should ask the first questions.
Question.
Yes.
I'm not going to coffee. I was struck by the orangutan study and taking being the predominant strategy. And, you know, in a prosperous human society like Europe, United States, South Korea, Japan, it would be considered stealing. And stealing is underreported, certainly in the United States, but not a predominant strategy. So I think it would be very interesting if you did a follow-up study and gave every orangutan a bag of bamboo branches, but of very different sizes. So some got a really big one and some got quite a small one, and see how the behaviors evolved under those circumstances.
Yeah, I think also a little bit of that is also semantics, that we specifically didn't call it theft, but rather taking, which can be resisted or not resisted. So basically what would count as theft would be, like our definition was, someone needs to take it uninvitedly, and then the one that is possessing the food actually needs to show some resistance. So actually most of them were not faced with resistance, but like I agree, I think it's also weird to just call it theft. That is sort of implying that. But I think, what would you predict would happen if you have the different distributions?
What would I predict?
Yeah.
I would predict that there would be a lot less taking.
I think, yeah, I definitely am interested in looking at that. There are a lot of theories on that, for example, the idea is that the reason that they might tolerate that is because, especially if you have a high value resource like a chimpanzee hunting a colobus monkey, others will constantly try to take it, so you might be just giving some that you can eat in peace, right?
So the difference between unresisted taking and co-feeding is that in a co-feeding situation, there's an active offering of...
So for co-feeding, just to jump back to that, it was kind of this example that the one that is possessing the food still physically remains in control of it, like this branch, and they just eat from the same one. And then for the different kinds of taking, we had the one without resistance, which is sometimes called tolerated theft, and then like kind of theft would be resisted taking. But requesting was the other one, where the one that tries to get food would produce some kind of signal, like a begging gesture. And then the rarest form was the kind of proactive offer, that the food possessor would proactively make a gesture to offer the food. Yes?
So on this one, this is a minor point, but when you presented those data initially, you said, it was a little puzzling that requests occur given how unsuccessful they are. I think two things are relevant. One is the absolute expected value, and the other is the relative expected value. So the absolute expected value is the payoff times the probability, and if the payoff is large, then even if the probability is low, it's worth doing. Now, the payoff isn't huge here, but the relative expected value is the value of the payoff times the probability for the individual relative to others, which seems to fit into your general framework pretty well. So it's akin to asking, why do poor people play the lottery so much when, the odds are so small? And the answer is because it would make such a big difference to them if they won versus a more affluent person who might be less affected. So the only time affluent people start playing the lottery a lot is when the payoff is huge, right? As we saw, a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
So my prediction would be that the requests are coming from subordinate individuals who have less privileged access to the resource much more frequently than individuals who are more likely to either initially possess it or acquire it through other means.
Yeah, it is. The most common that we saw was between mothers and their own infants, and then between the adult flanged male and adult females. There's also a little bit of work on orangutans in the wild with the food for sex hypothesis, that oftentimes females will request food and try to take it to basically assess if the male is very aggressive or potentially like a tolerant partner. So I think also to your point, I agree, if you just look at the request as what is the possible payoff in that one instance based on that one signal, it is very low. But if you also see it more like a kind of testing, if you are allowed and your request gets granted, that subsequently you might just continue taking because I received a signal, oh, you're handing me the food I'm asking for, so it must be fine. So I think one of the challenges is to see these as interconnected and not look at these transfer attempts in isolation, where then a request seems like maybe not a very good strategy, but if you then subsequently can just take food, which otherwise would be classified as tolerated theft, it's kind of the sequence that matters once a request was granted. Yes.
Among the offers that you observed, did you notice any type of like targeted helping or like targeted offering to certain other orangutans?
So the offers were most commonly produced by the adult male for adult females. So that maybe somewhat lines up with what is observed in the wild. But with targeted helping, what are you imagining, that someone specifically offers it to someone that doesn't have food? So usually the context was more that they were in the general vicinity of the food possessor, and oftentimes the females just sitting away or then approaching. So we didn't necessarily see it that they would move out of their way really far to bring someone food or something like that. Yes.
I have a question about the same data set, because I was a little bit surprised to see that kinship predicted nothing. And so it raises for me the question of when you have multivariable data sets like this, and for example, if you have inside your model a predictor variable like proximity, and hypothetically proximity could be downstream of kinship. Obviously I'm thinking of like very close examples of mother offspring dyads being more often in proximity to one another. I'm wondering like some of the details of how you might deal with that in a model, because if you've got, if location and proximity is basically a mediator on kinship, then you might have an underlying social strategy of being more generous towards kin, but it might not show up in your model if you have that issue of collinearity.
That's a very good point, and I think it's also for our data set perhaps like a little bit unfair, because usually orangutans also don't live in groups in the wild. They have the semi-solitary lifestyle, and within that specific group, all of the adult females had offspring with the male. So basically, except for 2 offsprings, all of them were actually related to the male, or they were basically mating with the male. So I think that would probably, I imagine, look differently in larger groups of chimpanzees, where you have more non-kin, no partner interactions. So I think probably it's not the fairest data set to assess kinship, but kind of our takeaway was that just at least in that context, in the moment, looking at the immediate variables, and like you say, it's totally fair to say like proximity is probably predicted by kinship and would explain a lot of the variation. Yeah, so I would agree with that.
It still means relationships matter. It's
Yeah.
just a different kind of relationship.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. For the rhesus macaque experiment and the social proximity/tolerance one, I saw that like there was in one population the sex difference of like there were more females within the circle for a longer period of time. In the other population, it was the opposite. Do you have a potential like explanation for it? Is it like insignificant, or is that just like the variation within the populations?
You mean like this figure? So there were. Oh yeah. So I think the question was that there seems to be a little bit of a difference here, that the Northwest group had more females spending more time inside of the circle compared to the Kyoto group. I think one explanation is that you had a higher ratio of females in the Northwest group. It was overall a smaller group, and then you can sort of see that there is actually in Kyoto one outlier up here that was a female there that was quite dominant, and likely a lot of the females would never dare to approach when she was in there. And it's also a little bit of a shortcoming that we can only, of course, measure with our tool once they actually navigate inside of the circle. There were probably a lot of instances where some individuals were just sitting further away and never saw a good opportunity to navigate into. So it also looks kind of at a sweet spot that you need to be perhaps dominant or persistent enough that you are willing to take that risk to go in there into the first place. But yeah, I think probably somewhat perhaps this dominant female and then the sex ratio across groups accounted for that. Yes.
I also have a question about the macaques. If the inner circle was occupied and macaques entered the liminal space, was there any sense of like macaques kind of respecting who had entered the liminal space first, or like some sort of cue, or if like an alpha were to then enter the liminal space, would they kind of like take precedent going into the middle circle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we also kind of initially thought it would be interesting to quantify that because it sort of looks like proto-queuing, not like a nice line, but they certainly would go in there. But probably it did not look like dominants would respect the queue. They would just, in these, I don't think I have it on this slides, but you can really see like a difference where they just, the dominant ones navigate straight in. Let me see. No, I removed that. But long story short, maybe here we can see it a little bit. That's one example where you can kind of see that Masanobu, the green one here, was the highest ranking one, and others were in there, but he would just directly walk into the circle no matter who was around. But then, for example, Joe, a lower ranking male, you can see would like literally just take a lot of like circle that actual circle, also seemingly always paying attention to who is inside and where they're looking. So that's something that we also try to do next, whether kind of the point at which they enter, what role the general head direction of the dominance inside of the circle plays in predicting that. But yeah, we can also probably look at this ordering in like the larger outside of the circle more detailed. Yes.
You mentioned really briefly the like kind of idea of was it information transfer, like communication as like the chain-of-meter model, but then for animal cognition or in animal communication, you talk about communication as manipulation. Can you give some reasons of why you think that, and also maybe why you think the difference?
Yeah, so the argument would be that most cases of animal communication, and a good documented one, if we take like vervet monkey alarm calls, are usually tied to like a very specific situation where you produce the signal and it's closely tied to eliciting one specific response. So I think this idea of just running with that Shannon-Weaver model that is about transferring information might fit maybe with human communication, where like a book probably doesn't necessarily approximately try to elicit a specific response from you, and you can say like, oh, it's like symbolic meaning with information. But in like most animal communication systems, you will see that signals, also intentional signals, are just tied to eliciting a specific response from someone, where like maybe a vervet alarm call would elicit a behavioral response of either like look up for the eagle or like go on your hind legs and scan for the snake. So there's always this tight coupling. They would not be using that alarm call to just refer to eagles at night because they had a bad dream or something. So I think that is something in most animal communication signal systems and intentional signals that I know of. It is not the case that they used to transfer information or refer to things. Of course, you can find some examples where you might sometimes refer to absent things, and maybe signature whistles and dolphins are perhaps one possible example. But I think on the whole, we probably would fare better with just assuming that they're trying to achieve some specific things and elicit specific behavioral responses. So especially for data sets that you would want to use to train on predicting that, I think the context of what might be their goal, the intention, and the behavioral outcomes is much more important. Yes.
I'm new to your discipline. I find it very interesting, but it means I have naive questions. And my naive question is, the circle that the macaques are respecting, is this a physical circle, or is it a hypothesized circle based on observations of previous behavior?
For that study, you can't see it to go on here, but it's like a like physical circle that I spray painted on the ground, and that circle was more to for social tolerance tests, the way that they are defined, an operationalization where you have just like a space where you can make the assumption there are valuable resources in this specific area. So that was actually something, the fact that we would spray paint it on the ground was also more for marking, oh, that's the place where I tried to drop the grapes in exactly, and lost for the macaques. But the fact that sometimes they would take like these almost perfect circles around the circle also made me wonder to what extent they might think about it in that shape. So I thought it would be fun at some point if I just spray painted a triangle on the ground. Will they now walk around that? Because it's not a physical barrier, it's just marked on the ground. But yeah, it's like bright orange as macaques, they should also see that as something popping out. But it's a good question, and I would love to figure out if the way that you put just visual markings on the ground would affect the way that they navigate around it. And
Any more questions? If not, then thank you. And wait, who wants to go to coffee? Are there going to be people singing? Yeah. Okay. Good. So maybe stay here and coordinate that. And thank you for
Thank you.
your talk.